Thanks for inviting me here, Matt, and for that cool intro. I'm Prima. I work at Pinterest. I've also worked at many previous companies in the past in different industries like oil and gas and fintech and music streaming, and now at Pinterest. One thing that all of these companies have in common is, guess what? Logs. That's one thing that all of them need to use, all of us need to use in the security industry. I've made a career for myself as a security engineer in the past few years. And getting information out of logs and building and creating log pipelines is something that has been very fascinating to me, and I've worked quite a bit in the area. So today I'm going to talk about how we can build resilient security log pipelines with a practice called chaos engineering. So the status quo for logs at the moment is basically, as you would know, blue teams, meaning the defensive security teams, are highly reliant on logs for all sorts of incident response activities. In some cases, forensics as well, the stuff that Sarah talked about. So sanity of logs and availability of logs is a very, very important thing for any incident response team to be successful in their job, period. And at the moment, the way logging works is log pipelines that are built by security engineers who are not necessarily specialized software engineers at all times. And so they are built in a very fragile way in some ways. It's built with like glue code. It's built for functionality, not necessarily for resilience. And then there are multiple single points of failures in the log pipelines, if you think about it. So I'll start with an example here, right? That's not necessarily everybody's infrastructure, but it's somebody's infrastructure out there. Let's say a lot of the companies in the area at the moment are collecting logs in a serverless manner. A lot of collection happens on AWS using Lambda functions. Let's say, for example, if you want to collect logs from a third-party cloud service provider that doesn't natively have the capability for log forwarding, but you want to collect logs by writing a script that proactively fetches it from the API. The script runs in a Lambda function, for example, on AWS. Then the logs are funneled into an S3 bucket. From there, they go into either Elasticsearch, Elk cluster, or Splunk, or Sumo Logic, or what have you. Now, just in this one example, you can see there are at least 3 points at which the log flow can fail. Either the API returns some errors and the script that's written to pull the logs isn't able to fetch it successfully. The running of the Lambda function itself fails. Or let's say the connection between the S3 bucket and Splunk or Sumo Logic or Elk fails. And at all of these points, the log flow can stop completely. And this is a very simplistic example. Then there are so many nuances, right? When you're collecting logs from an application that has, say, multiple log types and multiple services, even if you figure out that the entirety of the log flow has failed, observing log dips and spikes and stuff like that, it would still be very difficult to know when one type of log within the that's coming from the application has failed. So for example, if application is forwarding authentication logs and telephony logs and say administrative logs, and let's say just the administrative logs fail, are you going to be able to detect it? The likelihood of that is probably not very high, considering how we've traditionally been setting up observability around logging, and also the house of cards way in which the log pipelines are created. So let's consider this scenario, right? For an incident response team, they come into work on a fine Monday morning just to find out that a whole lot of laptops have been reporting to be infected with ransomware. And the number of infected devices keeps increasing. The incident response team starts to dig into logs just to find out that their systems haven't been collecting logs successfully for the last 2 weeks, and they didn't realize it. You can imagine how big of a issue this would be. If the team is lucky, they'd be able to go to the source and get the logs from there. But if they're unlucky, the source has not been holding the logs in, let's say, for longer than a week. And so what do you do now? And this is maybe a few weeks is a short time span, but let's say if this was about months, I know of systems that do not retain logs beyond, they only retain logs up to 2 weeks or so, and then when it comes down to looking at them at the source after a few months, you probably won't find anything. So this is the status quo of logging as we know it. As I mentioned earlier, the pipelines are usually built just for functionality and not for robustness. A reason that is because of the rewarding structure. Only functionality is rewarded, speed is rewarded. We are not necessarily incentivizing our engineers for resilience and for robust builds. There are no regular development life cycles. It doesn't go through a QA, for example, like regular software dev does. Security builds tend to be more, this is just one script. This is fine. This doesn't need to go through a periodic review or QA review or testing or anything like that. That's how these things are built. And when it comes down to logging, every device and service as we know it is a special snowflake. As most of you would probably know, most systems don't want to do log forwarding in one standard way. Each system and each application and each service that you're trying to collect it from needs a specially engineered solution that works just for them. And so now you have N specially engineered solutions that work for N applications and N number of services. And that's another challenge that we all face. So what can we do? There are some obvious things that we all can do, which is basically the first thing, the most basic is monitoring. Set up monitoring for log dips and spikes and flat lines, particularly. Sanity check your alert configurations before pushing them in production. Make sure that the alerts that are coming in for the flat lines themselves are working. Because what if the log flow isn't working and the alerts aren't working, then again, you're not going to know about it. Involve DevOps and QA in the dev practices. These are some of the easiest solutions and some of the most basic solutions, I'd say. They may not be easy depending on the size of the organization, but this is the basic stuff that we need to do. Beyond that, what we can start doing is basically engage in the practice of chaos engineering. And chaos is basically, it's an empirical and experimental approach that addresses chaos in distributed systems at scale. So this is something that was popularized by Netflix. They released a tool a couple of years ago called Chaos Monkey. And over a period of time, they've open sourced it. They've open sourced another tool called Simian Army, and Chaos Monkey, as I know it, is a part of Simian Army, or the other way around. Netflix is who made this practice really popular. And then after that point, a lot of the very big Bay Area companies have been engaging in this. This is a very popular SRE practice. At Google, the team that does this is known as DIRT, D-R-T. And Dropbox engages in it. I think Microsoft engages in it as well. So with this, what engineers can do is basically inject controlled experiments into your networks, into your systems, inject inject failures or potential of failures, break things on purpose, identify what are the knock-on effects, and basically see if the knock-on effects match your hypothesis that you'd created before injecting these failures into systems or services or networks. So this does require for us to kind of have some idea about how the systems and the services are connected to each other. If there are things that you believe should probably be working a particular way, that should go into your hypothesis. And when the experiment is released, one needs to observe the actual effects of what happens when the failure is injected. One of the most useful case for this is basically a lot of the times things that we believe are working a particular way, especially in distributed complex systems, they may not be working the way we think. So the example that I gave you earlier about basically logs from a particular application that are distributed, divided into 3 or more categories, and all of the log flow hasn't failed, but one category has failed. To identify scenarios like that, something like this could be really useful. And another thing is that observing something that fails gives us a well-defined problem, because a lot of the times what happens is we as security engineers have a vague clue about something that's not working quite right, but you can't go to software engineers or anybody who is building these things in your team and say, oh, this is not working quite right. So what happens is chaos engineering and chaos experiment, the results of it gives you a well-defined problem that you can take to your builders and tell them, this specifically is not working this particular way, the way we thought it was working or that it was supposed to be working. And that's another advantage of it. Again, every approach has limitations, so this is no silver bullet. One of the biggest limitation of chaos engineering is if observability hasn't been set up right, this approach is going to be futile. So before you engage in an experiment like this, you need to be able to see the systems that you've released the experiment on. And it's basically never to be run on a hypothesis that you think for which it's definitely going to fail. So never run a chaos experiment on something that you know is going to fail. The whole purpose of chaos engineering is not to break things on purpose. That's not the point. The point is to observe whether or not things break, to basically uncover the unknown unknowns in your infrastructure, in your environment. And so that should always be the focus. Another thing is it requires a high risk appetite from any security team or any team for that matter. Security teams as it is tend to be really lean. They usually make up for either 10% or less of the entire engineering org in any given company. So prioritizing for something like this can be really difficult. And to get buy-in for something like this can be really difficult as well. But the benefit is that once you have gotten a buy-in and once you have run one of these experiments, your confidence and your trust in the systems that we are managing is going to be better than ever. And this will give you a chance to make sure that things work as they are supposed to, as well as uncover it when things don't work as they're supposed to, and systems display different behavior. And all of this, especially on from the security point of view, is on paper still. So this is a thought experiment that I'd done in conjunction with some of my friends in the industry. This is all in my own time that I've been doing after work, thinking about how chaos engineering can help us in security. This is a very popular SRE practice, and it is believed to be working perfectly well for them. But for security, especially from an incident response point of view, there aren't any tools or experiments that I've run yet. I do plan to build some in the next 6 months or so, and hopefully open source it as well. My friend Aaron, with whom I conducted some of these thought experiments and exercises, has open sourced a tool called Chaos Slinger. It's available on GitHub, and you all can take a look at it. Yeah, so that's my talk today. And I'm SecNerdette on Twitter. You can follow me, and I'm open for any questions. And I'd definitely like to give a big shout out to my friend Tammy and Nora Jones. So Tammy ran chaos engineering at Dropbox. Now she's a part of a chaos engineering startup called Gremlin. Same with Aaron. Aaron ran chaos at United Health and now has his own startup as well. And Nora Jones was a part of the original, she's the OG of chaos at Netflix. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Chaos reigns supreme. Boys in front.
Thank you. That's very interesting stuff. In terms of the first example you gave, where engineers show up to work on a Monday morning and they find that they have ransomware and there's no logging, how would you, what specific test would you run using the chaos principle to kind of test to see that whether that failure is imminent and prevent it?
Could you please define what imminent means?
Maybe not imminent, but to find out whether you are vulnerable to that particular scenario, how would you use chaos to test that?
Sure. So I think in this particular scenario, I think that chaos for me is in incident response particularly, chaos for me is the next logical step after tabletop exercises. So in this particular case, what I would do would be inject there are multiple ways in which this can be addressed, right? So we can inject network failure, for example. We can take down the logging. We can take the logging server off of the network completely, and that way no logs are available whatsoever. We can try and inject failure into, let's say, any of our network routers, switches, any of the devices that lead up to. So basically, make sure that your failover or failopen or whatever, however you've designed it, works fine. Another way in which we can do it is basically inject failure into log collection for a particular service, not the entire stack, just one little thing that you absolutely needed, and see if it's able to, if the flow is still intact or does it fail. The same way on networks, does the failover or failopen work well, or does it still fail? Those would be some of the exercises. And then basically keep testing the rest of the hypothesis, because it's not just about whether or not your one system survives or fails. It's also about what happens when this fails, what knock-on effects did you anticipate, and what else could you have done, and did that other thing also not work suddenly? So I can give you one example where during one of my ex-workplaces, writing log collection for a particular system was, it was so fragile. The way to do it was that if I made a typo in the input for my new system that I want to get logs from, if I made a typo in that one file for that one new input, all of my previous ones would fail. And there was no way for me to know that until something actually happened, or unless somebody told me about it. So in this case, if I was, say, a new employee at a shop and there was all this historical kind of infrastructure that the people who built it were no longer around to share info about, that would have been pretty bad. That would be game over. So scenarios like that. Does it make sense?
Another question?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that talk. So what strategies can you share that you've had success with regards to selling chaos engineering within the organization?
I haven't yet. I haven't tried it. This is all, as I said, this is all on paper still. What I'm going to do, though, my plan is to create a small kind of app to do something like this for me in a lab environment. See how it performs there, and if it's any good or if it's any successful, open source it later, and perhaps then try and convince a company that has a fairly mature logging infrastructure and a lot of confidence in it to actually test it in a prod environment. Also, I wouldn't start with something that is super mission critical. I'd start with something benign and then kind of work my way up from there.
Questions from the back? We got all the smart people in back, right? No? You guys asleep? You guys awake? Thank you so much, Prima.
Thank you.